Enter 2026 with a mind that cannot be shaken. 2026 does not arrive as a clean beginning. It arrives carrying the same uncertainty, the same instability, and the same pressures that defined the years before it. The world has not slowed down. It has not become more reasonable. It has not become more forgiving. Expectations remain high. Attention remains fragmented, and the demand to react remains constant. Most people enter a new year hoping circumstances will improve. Stoicism asks for something different. It is for a mind that does not depend on circumstances at all. This is not a message of withdrawal or indifference. It is a discipline of engagement. The Stoics did not seek to escape the world. They sought to meet it without being broken by it. They understood that chaos is not an interruption of life. It is the condition of life. What matters is not whether disorder exists, but whether the mind is trained to remain steady within it. Many today feel exhausted, not because they do too much, but because they resist too much. They resist uncertainty. They resist discomfort. They resist outcomes they cannot control. This resistance consumes more energy than any hardship itself. Anxiety grows from the belief that the future must be secured before one can be calm. Anger grows from the belief that others should behave differently. Fear grows from the belief that loss is intolerable. Stoicism does not deny pain, loss, or injustice. It denies only the assumption that these things have the power to destroy one's inner stability. It teaches that while events are largely outside our command, judgment, intention, and character remain fully ours. Entering 2026 with a mind that cannot be shaken does not mean becoming unfeeling or detached. It means becoming precise about what deserves concern, precise about where effort belongs, precise about the difference between what happens to you and what you become in response. This training is not theoretical. It is daily, practical, and demanding, and it begins not with hope, but with clarity. The first task of Stoic discipline is to dismantle a deeply ingrained illusion, the belief that you are meant to control life. Modern culture reinforces this belief constantly. You are told that with enough planning, enough information, enough effort, you should be able to predict outcomes, secure stability, and avoid disruption. When this fails, as it inevitably does, the failure is interpreted as personal inadequacy. The Stoics saw this error clearly. Stated that some things depend on us, and some things do not. Everything that follows in Stoic practice rests on this distinction. It is not a slogan, it is a boundary, and most suffering comes from crossing it again and again. You do not control other people's choices. You do not control how the world responds to your efforts. You do not control economic cycles, political instability, illness, aging, or death. Yet much of modern anxiety comes from quietly assuming that when the mind demands certainty, where none is possible, it becomes tense by default. It is never at rest, because reality never complies. This tension shows itself in familiar ways, the constant checking of news and messages, as if vigilance could prevent harm, the rehearsing of arguments that have not yet happened, the anger towards strangers who disrupt expectations, the feeling of being behind, threatened, or exposed. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of misplaced effort. Stoicism does not ask you to stop caring. It asks you to care accurately. The Stoic does not withdraw from action. He withdraws from illusion. He acts fully where action is possible, and releases attachment where it is not. What depends on you is narrower than most people are comfortable admitting. It includes your judgments, your intentions, and your actions in the present moment. It includes whether you act with honesty or deception, courage or avoidance, restraint or excess. It includes how you interpret events, not the events themselves. This narrowing is not a loss. It is a relief. When responsibility is placed only where it belongs, energy returns. You are no longer fighting the structure of reality. You are cooperating with it. Consider anger. Most anger arises when reality violates an expectation. Someone behaves unfairly, a plan fails, an obstacle appears. Beneath the emotion is the belief that this should not have happened. The Stoic challenges this belief directly. Why should the world behave according to your preferences? Why should people act rationally, kindly, or competently at all times? Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he would encounter selfishness, ignorance, and injustice, not as a complaint, but as preparation. Preparation is the opposite of pessimism. It is alignment. When the mind expects difficulty, it is not shocked by it. When it is not shocked, it is not destabilized. When it is not destabilized, it can respond intelligently instead of reactively. Anxiety follows a similar pattern. It is often framed as concern for the future, but in truth, it is resistance to uncertainty. The anxious mind demands guarantees. It wants to know that efforts will succeed, that relationships will last, that health will hold, that stability will continue. The future cannot offer these assurances. The Stoic response is not reassurance, but acceptance. Acceptance does not mean surrendering effort. It means releasing the demand for outcomes. You still work, you still plan, you still care, but you do so without staking your inner peace on results you cannot command. Seneca warned that those who depend on hope for tranquility will never be tranquil, because hope is hostage to chance. Modern life makes this distinction harder, not easier. Technology creates the illusion of immediacy and control. Problems appear solvable with enough optimization. Social media turns comparison into a constant background noise. You see fragments of other people's lives and interpret them as standards. The mind begins to measure itself against curated outcomes it did not choose and cannot verify. This produces a quiet but persistent unrest. You feel behind without knowing where you are going. You feel evaluated without knowing by whom. Stoicism cuts through this by returning focus to character, not how you appear, not how you rank, but how you act when no one is watching and outcomes are uncertain. To live this way requires discipline, not the discipline of rigid self-control, but the discipline of attention. Each day presents countless opportunities to confuse what is yours with what is not. A comment provokes you. A delay frustrates you. A setback discourages you. In each case, the Stoic pauses and asks a simple question: is this within my control? If it is not, resistance is wasted effort. If it is, action is required. This clarity removes drama from decision-making. It does not remove difficulty, but it removes confusion. And confusion is heavier than difficulty. Injustice is often cited as an objection to Stoicism. People fear that acceptance means tolerating wrongdoing. The Stoics did not argue for passivity. They argued for internal independence. You can oppose injustice without poisoning your own mind. You can act firmly without hatred. You can accept that wrongdoing exists without surrendering your values. What Stoicism refuses is the belief that external disorder justifies internal collapse. When you allow events to dictate your emotional state, you surrender the only domain that is truly yours. The Stoic insists on retaining this ground, even when everything else is unstable. This is not easy. It runs against instinct. Instinct seeks control, validation, and certainty. Stoic training replaces instinct with reason. Not cold reason, but clear reason. Reason that recognizes limits and works within them. As 2026 unfolds, there will be disruptions you did not plan for. Some will be minor, some may be severe. The Stoic does not predict which. He prepares for the fact that they will occur. This preparation is internal, not logistical. It is the readiness to meet events without panic, bitterness, or self-pity. A mind that cannot be shaken is not one that feels nothing. It is one that does not add unnecessary suffering to what already exists. It feels pain without resentment, loss without collapse, and uncertainty without fear dominating every thought. This is the foundation. Until the illusion of control is addressed, no amount of motivation, positivity, or productivity will bring stability. Once the boundary is clear, the mind begins to settle. Not because the world has become manageable, but because the self has become disciplined. The rest of Stoic practice builds on this ground. Without it, everything else is theory. With it, calm becomes possible, even in a world that offers no guarantees. Once the boundary between what depends on you and what does not is understood, a more uncomfortable realization follows. Much of the distress in modern life does not come from events themselves, but from the desires and attachments carried into those events. The Stoics did not see desire as inherently wrong. They saw unexamined desire as dangerous. Desire promises relief. It promises that if you obtain the right outcome, the right recognition, the right security, the mind will finally rest. Yet the mind trained on outcomes rarely rests at all. When one desire is fulfilled, another replaces it. When fulfillment is delayed or denied, frustration appears. In both cases, peace remains conditional. Seneca warned that the more a person depends on external goods for contentment, the more fragile their happiness becomes. This fragility is everywhere today. Careers are not just means of livelihood, but sources of identity. Relationships are not just bonds, but proofs of worth. Visibility is mistaken for value. Approval is treated as nourishment. The Stoic does not deny the importance of work, relationships, or social belonging. He denies their authority over his inner state. He understands that when identity is outsourced to external markers, the self becomes unstable by design. Every compliment is a lift. Every criticism is a blow. Every comparison is a threat. Much emotional volatility comes from this arrangement. Anger flares when status feels challenged. Envy grows when others appear to advance. Shame arises when expectations are not met. These emotions feel personal, but they are structural. They emerge from tying self-worth to variables outside your control. Stoic practice begins to loosen these ties. It does not eliminate preference, it eliminates dependence. You may prefer success, comfort, and respect, but you do not require them to act well. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that no one can harm him unless he allows his judgment to be corrupted. This was not bravado, it was an observation. Insults, losses, and setbacks do not enter the mind as damage. They enter as impressions. The damage occurs only if the impression is accepted, without examination. This is where emotional mastery begins, not by suppression, but by scrutiny. When a feeling arises, the Stoic does not immediately obey it. He asks what belief supports it. Anger often rests on the belief that one has been wronged beyond tolerance. Fear rests on the belief that loss is unbearable. Envy rests on the belief that another's gain diminishes one's own worth. These beliefs are rarely tested. They are assumed. Stoic discipline tests them relentlessly. Is this truly intolerable or merely uncomfortable? Is this loss absolute, or does it threaten an image I am attached to? Does another person's success actually deprive me of virtue, reason, or integrity? When these questions are asked honestly, many emotions lose their force, not because they are invalid, but because their foundation is weak. The mind begins to see that much of its agitation is self-generated. Attachment operates quietly. You may not think of yourself as attached, yet feel deeply unsettled when routines are disrupted, when plans change, or when recognition is absent. Attachment is not always dramatic. Often it appears as subtle resistance to change. The Stoics trained themselves to expect change, not as a threat, but as a constant. This expectation reshapes the inner landscape. When you stop assuming permanence, you stop experiencing impermanence as betrayal. Relationships evolve, roles shift, bodies age, circumstances revert. None of this is personal. It is structural. To demand otherwise is to demand that reality be different from what it is. Ego complicates this further. Ego insists that experiences should reflect personal significance, that setbacks are humiliations, that success confirms superiority. Stoicism dismantles this narrative. It reframes the self, not as a central figure to be affirmed, but as a rational agent tasked with acting well within given conditions. This reframing is not diminishing, it is stabilizing. When the need to be special recedes, pressure recedes with it. You are no longer performing for an imagined audience. You are no longer measuring every moment against an internal scoreboard. Social pressure loses much of its grip under this view. The fear of missing out, the fear of falling behind, the fear of being overlooked, all depend on the belief that one's life must follow a particular script. The Stoic rejects the script. He focuses instead on whether his responses are guided by reason and aligned with virtue. Virtue, for the Stoics, was not moral display. It was clarity of judgment and consistency of action. Courage meant acting rightly, despite fear. Temperance meant choosing restraint over excess. Justice meant fairness, regardless of personal advantage. Wisdom meant seeing things as they are, not as desire distorts them. These are not abstract ideals, they are daily practices. You exercise courage when you speak honestly instead of defensively. You exercise temperance when you refuse distraction that weakens attention. You exercise justice when you treat others fairly without expecting reward. You exercise wisdom when you pause before reacting. Modern culture often treats emotional intensity as authenticity. The Stoics disagreed. They saw uncontrolled emotion not as depth, but as confusion. This does not mean emotional numbness. It means emotional proportion, feeling what fits the situation and no more. When desire is disciplined, the mind becomes lighter. It still cares, but it does not cling. It still strives, but it does not demand. It still engages, but it does not entangle its peace with outcomes. This discipline is quiet. It does not announce itself. Others may not notice it at all, but internally, it changes everything. The background noise of comparison softens. The urgency of validation fades. The compulsion to prove oneself weakens. In its place appears a steadier orientation. You begin to ask not whether something will bring approval or advantage, but whether it is aligned with reason and character. This question simplifies life. It does not make choices easier, but it makes them clearer. As 2026 advances, you will encounter temptations to abandon this clarity. You will be invited to react, to compare, to crave, to resent. Stoicism does not promise immunity to these impulses. It offers a method for meeting them without surrender. When desire no longer dictates your inner state, freedom begins to take shape. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from inner compulsion. This is not the end of training. It is the preparation for facing what remains unavoidable. There remains one confrontation that no discipline can avoid. Even when control is clarified and desire is disciplined, life continues to impose losses that cannot be negotiated away. Bodies weaken, relationships end, efforts fail, injustice persists, death approaches, not as an abstraction, but as a certainty with an unknown timetable. Most modern discomfort around these facts comes not from their existence, but from avoidance. The culture trains people to distract themselves from impermanence, to treat aging as a defect, loss as a malfunction, and death as a taboo. Stoicism does the opposite. It brings these realities into view deliberately, not to provoke fear, but to remove surprise. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you could leave life at any moment, and that this truth should inform how you speak, act, and think. This was not a morbid fixation. It was a grounding exercise. When time is acknowledged as finite, trivial anxieties lose their authority. The mind becomes less willing to waste itself on resentment, vanity, and delay. Impermanence reveals priorities. When you know that roles are temporary and possessions unstable, you stop mistaking them for foundation. You begin to understand that the only thing carried intact through change is character. Reputation dissolves, status shifts, circumstances vanish, but how you chose to act remains part of who you are. This recognition changes how loss is experienced. Loss still hurts. Stoicism never claimed otherwise. But pain is no longer confused with injustice. You do not conclude that something has gone wrong with the universe simply because something has ended. You recognize that endings are not failures of life. They are features of it. Injustice presents a more difficult challenge. People suffer through no fault of their own. Effort is not always rewarded. Integrity is not always protected. The Stoics did not deny this. They refused only the conclusion that such unfairness nullifies virtue or excuses vice. Epictetus warned against allowing external wrongdoing to infect internal judgment. This is not passivity. It is self-preservation. When bitterness takes root, it does not punish the unjust. It distorts the one who carries it. Rage corrodes clarity. Hatred narrows perception. Self-pity weakens resolve. The Stoic response to injustice is firm without being consumed. You act where action is possible. You speak where speech is required. You resist where resistance is justified. But you do not surrender your inner order to external disorder. You do not allow resentment to become a second injury. This stance is often misunderstood as emotional coldness. It is not. It is emotional discipline. It recognizes that outrage without effectiveness is indulgence, not virtue, and that clarity, even under pressure, is a form of strength. Fate, in Stoic thought, is not a supernatural force to appease. It is the totality of causes beyond individual control. You are born into a particular body, era, and set of circumstances. You did not choose them. You are still responsible for how you respond within them. This responsibility is not heavy when understood correctly. It does not require heroism. It requires alignment. To accept fate is not to approve of everything that happens. It is to stop arguing with reality and start working within it. Resistance to fate often appears as rumination, replaying events, imagining alternatives, fixating on what should have been different. This mental habit drains energy without changing outcomes. The Stoic trains himself to recognize when thought has crossed from reflection into resistance. Acceptance is not resignation. It is the decision to stop wasting effort on the irreversible. When the mind releases this effort, it becomes available for what remains possible. Attention returns to the present moment, the only place where action exists. Mortality sharpens this focus further. Death is the ultimate boundary. It clarifies that no amount of anxiety can extend life, and no amount of avoidance can prevent its end. What remains is the quality of the time that is given. The Stoics did not speculate about what comes after death. They focused on how awareness of death should influence life. It should encourage honesty, restraint, and urgency, without haste. Urgency to act well. Haste avoided because clarity requires patience. Fear of death often masks fear of having lived poorly. When actions are guided by impulse, distraction, or conformity, the thought of finality becomes threatening. When actions are guided by reason and integrity, death loses some of its terror. It becomes an endpoint, not a verdict. This does not eliminate grief when others die. Stoicism allows grief, it discourages despair. Grief acknowledges attachment. Despair rejects reality. The Stoic grieves without self-destruction. He honors what was without demanding that it continue. As 2026 unfolds, reminders of impermanence will appear without invitation. News of illness, sudden changes, quiet endings. The trained mind does not harden against these reminders. It uses them to refine perspective. Each reminder asks the same question. Given the limits of time and control, how should one act now? Not grandly, not dramatically, but consistently, with fairness, with restraint, with courage when required. Resilience is often misunderstood as toughness. Stoicism defines it differently. Resilience is the capacity to remain oriented toward reason under pressure. It is not the absence of emotion, but the refusal to be ruled by it. This capacity is built through repetition. Each time you choose clarity over reaction, it strengthens. Each time you accept loss without collapse, it deepens. Each time you face uncertainty without panic, it stabilizes. The world does not reward this discipline visibly. There are no guarantees of recognition. Stoicism does not promise admiration. It promises coherence, the sense that your inner life is not at the mercy of events. This coherence becomes increasingly valuable in unstable times. When external structures shake, those without inner structure are shaken with them. When identity is tied to outcomes, instability feels existential. When identity is tied to character, instability becomes navigable. A mind that cannot be shaken is not invulnerable. It is grounded. It knows what it stands on. It knows what cannot be taken unless surrendered. This grounding is not achieved once and for all. It is renewed daily. Some days it holds firmly, other days it wavers. Stoicism does not demand perfection. It demands return. Return to the distinction between what depends on you and what does not. Return to disciplined desire. Return to acceptance of impermanence. These returns are the practice, and they prepare the way for a conclusion that is not dramatic, but steady. 2026 will not ask whether you are ready. It will move forward as every year does, bringing moments of clarity and moments of strain, periods of calm and periods of disruption. Stoicism does not pretend otherwise. What it offers is not protection from events, but steadiness within them. A mind that cannot be shaken is not built by force or optimism. It is built by repeated, quiet choices. The choice to focus effort where it belongs. The choice to examine judgments before obeying them. The choice to act with integrity even when outcomes are uncertain. The choice to accept what cannot be changed without surrendering what can. This way of living does not make life smaller. It makes it cleaner, fewer unnecessary battles, less inner noise, less dependence on approval, luck, or circumstance, more attention to what is actually happening, more respect for time, energy, and character. There's some days you will succeed at this. Other days you will not. Stoicism allows for this. The practice is not measured by emotional perfection, but by the willingness to return to reason when you notice you have drifted. Each return strengthens the habit. Each habit strengthens the mind. If there is one intention worth carrying into 2026, it is this: to stop outsourcing your inner state to a world that cannot be controlled, to take responsibility for judgment, action, and character, and to release responsibility for everything else. This is not withdrawal from life. It is engagement without self-destruction. The Stoics believed that a good life is available under any external conditions, because its foundation is internal, not comfort, not success, but coherence between what you value and how you act. When this coherence is present, fear loses much of its grip. Anger becomes less consuming. Uncertainty becomes tolerable. This channel exists to support that training, not through motivation or spectacle, but through steady reminders of what endures when everything else shifts. If this way of thinking resonates, remain here. Return when clarity is needed. Practice alongside others who are choosing discipline over noise. Enter 2026, not expecting ease, but prepared for reality, with a mind trained to remain steady, whatever arrives.